Hello, welcome to my home studio. Welcome back. If you are joining again from last week, thanks for coming back. If you are new to this feed, thanks for joining. Same as last week, whether you are a member at the BCA Clay Studio, you're connected through BCA in some other way, whether you are totally new to the medium of ceramics, whether you're thinking about taking a class when your local studio reopens, however you found yourself here watching me, thanks for joining. And especially thank you for staying home. All right, so for today I've got 5 balls of clay, all about 1.25 pounds to 1.5 pounds. Let's try that again. There we go. So for centering, I'm going to make sure that my left hand, as the clay is coming around, hey Keisha, so that my left hand engages the clay as it comes around. I'm trying to give it essentially a negative space to form to. One of the things I always tell students in real life classes is that you are stronger than the clay. So much of pottery looks like you need to be really strong to do, but in reality, a lot of this is just figuring out how to best use your anatomy and leverage to manipulate the clay. So my left hand is right about 7 o'clock in the wheel. My right hand is driving the clay back up my forearm, and it's got to go somewhere. Shazlaraz, yes. You can, so long as the wheel head is dry, you can just throw it right on. So last week when we did some cylinders, the shape was that of like a hockey puck or a tuna can. Basically, I like to approach centering as a really rough draft of the form that I'm going to throw in the end. So with a straight-sided cylinder, it makes a lot of sense to have a straight-sided, flat top centered ball of clay. For a bowl, knowing that that's going to start a little narrower and flare out wide, I'm going to center to that same shape. So once I get my ball of clay centered, I'm going to squeeze it just a bit at the bottom to end up with like a doorknob shape. And from there, I'm going to drive down. And so my thumbs in this maneuver, they have one job, and it's to travel down and then travel right back. I like to use my 2 thumbs connected. They sort of stabilize each other. So I am of the mindset that a bowl is going to be strongest when it's thrown as a bowl right from the start, rather than trying to force a bowl shape from a cylinder. So right from the get-go, I want to establish my open shape as having a curve. So to do that, I'm going to use my fingers to pull back toward me, and right about the time where my fingers are pointed straight down at the wheel head, I'm going to allow my hands to climb up and out of the bowl just to establish that curve right away. So I'm curling right there. My fingertips are pointed straight down, and let them come up and out. And my thumb is giving a little bit of pressure back that way. So from here, what I'm going to do is just sort of refine that curve. So right now we've got a really small bowl, but a bowl nonetheless. If I want something that is shallower and wider, I might sort of bring this down. If I want something that is taller and deeper, I'll set that curve. But before I start doing any pulls, I'm just letting my fingers sort of travel down and back up. This is providing compression and also just establishing that shape. So once I have my shape, I'm going to go into my pulling motion. So my left hand is going to be the driver, thumb on the outside, fingertips on the inside, and then my right hand is going to support my left thumb. And I'm applying some pressure, pinching, and I'm following the curve of that bowl. The curve that I've set through that refining step, that's the trajectory that my hands are going to take. I'll go back, do another pass at that. Every couple of pulls, I am going to do a compression. So whether I sort of hug the clay this way or do it like a peace sign draped over, I want to stabilize the rim and then apply some downward pressure. In our cylinder from last week, that was straight down because the wall was established to be a straight cylinder. With a bowl, I'm trying to drive the pressure straight back down the wall that we've set. So not exactly straight down. From here I can go back in and add a couple more pulls. There's no set rule about this. I'm just basically trying to figure out how much stretch this individual ball of clay has in it. After a few pulls, I'm going to change over to using a rib. Some of the questions that I've been getting throughout the week are about tools that you can get to do some work from home. I really like these the Mud Tools series of ribs. The really nice thing about them is they're color coded by the density of the material. So I like primarily the green ones, which are like the stiff but not stiffest rib. And this one is a particular favorite of mine. If you've ever taken a class with me at BCA, you know that this rib like never leaves my wheel. I like this profile for bowls, and then I use a lot of the straight profile for the outside of shapes. So I've got my rib inside, and I'm using the profile just to sort of tidy up any of the inconsistencies in the curve. I'm pushing a little bit from the outside with the fingers of my right hand, but the rib's not moving much. It's just my fingers pushing up against the rib. From here, I'll go back and do another pull. At some, throughout the process, I like to alternate between the ribs and my fingers. I like the ribs because it allows you to cover more territory at the same time. It also eliminates having to get all the tips of your fingers to sort of talk to each other and work in unison. But at the same time, you do lose some feel on the clay with the rib. Welcome to those who are new. Thanks for tuning in. So I'll go in with this tool, another Mud Tools product. This is the Mud Shark, and I'll cut a little bit of clay away down at the base. This is another sort of reason why it's nice to have, why it's nice to center to a doorknob shape for a bowl. Is that we know we're going to cut off some clay, and so knowing that that's going to be where most of that clay has to come out, we limit how much clay waste there is. I'll switch over to a metal rib for the outside. And from the inside, I'm just pushing in. My fingers are running up from the center spot of the bowl, up along the inside, pushing out against the metal rib, sort of the opposite of what we did with the green rib on the inside. The rib is not moving too much. And then as a final pass, I'm going to take the metal rib and stretch from the inside. So before I get going here, I want to do a pretty heavy compression on the rim. This step is going to ask a lot of the clay. I'm going to ask it to stretch, and so tightening up the rim is going to be helpful to make sure it doesn't warp, doesn't tear, that sort of thing. So I'm going to hold my rib right around 3 o'clock, not quite flat, but I'm going to go from here. You can see it's going to go well beyond that 45-degree angle. I'm going to add some pressure to the rim, and then I'm going to let this come down all the way on the inside. And the idea here is that the rim will stretch a little bit wider, and then on the way down, everything else underneath the rim sort of catches up to it. I get asked a lot when I demo this in class, like, why not start from the bottom? And the idea is that if we start at the top, it prevents, knowing that either the top has to catch up to the bottom or the bottom has to catch up to the top. Starting at the top doesn't ever make it so that the rim gets stretched out too far and breaks or tears. And I can do as many passes of this sort of top down that I want or that the bowl will allow. And from here, I'll give a final compression using a chamois or a piece of plastic and call this one done. All right, so we'll swap to a new tile. With these masonite bats, I find that it's really nice to get a little bit of moisture on them and then let them absorb that. So before I throw the clay down, I want all of this want it to lose its shine. It'll help make it for a little bit of a sticky surface. Welcome to those who just joined the feed. And if anybody has questions about bowls or really anything clay related, fire away. So for this one, we're going to do a slightly different shape. That last bowl really flared out. This one, we're going to have the sort of a concave bowl that comes back in at the top. I really like this style bowl for salsa, guac, dips, that sort of thing, because the bowl sort of naturally contains whatever's in it. They're a bit of a nightmare when it comes to storage. So just inherently they don't stack well. So they take up a lot of space, but I feel like they're a really good shape to have around. So again, we're going to start with a centered ball of clay that has a slightly narrower base than top, just acting as a rough draft for our end shape. Drill down. And the difference with this one is as I open up, once I establish that curve, I'm going to treat it more like a cylinder. So I don't want to come out all the way to have a corner. I do want to have that scoop so my fingers are pointed down and then start to draw up. But then I'm going to use the outside of my hand to add some pressure back and throw it more vertically. From here, same thing, I'm going to refine my curve so my fingers on the inside are really working the scoop of this. And once I've got that set, I'm going to switch to a bowl. So a concept that I really like and often encourage students to use is think about drawing in space. So I'm not much of a 2D person, but in the same way that you can manipulate a pen or a brush on paper, the idea here is that we're going to move our hands in a path that creates the outer, the profile of our form. So I'm scooping out and then back in. I'm going to switch over to a metal rib for this one. Thanks, Benton. And I'm pushing. I really love these flexible ribs because I can set sort of the, whatever curve I want on the outside and then push the inside into it. It's almost like a mold. Do a couple of passes like that. And give it a nice compression with the chamois. So thinking about using this bowl in real life, for guac or salsa or something like that, it's a little, it's feeling like it's a little contained. This curve through here coming back in is great, and I want to keep that, but I can open this up a little bit. So for those who just joined, thanks for watching. If you're from the Burlington area, if you are not from the Burlington area or not connected with BCA already through Vermont, let me know where you're watching from. Steph, welcome. So one of the centering tricks, I guess it's not a trick, it's a technique. But one of the techniques I like to use in centering a lot, especially for larger forms, is to sort of tilt the clay out of its axis. So normally I do this on larger pieces, but I think it's just sort of interesting. So I'm going to share that. So we would cone the clay up. And then, rather than trying to drive everything straight back down and keep it on center, I'm going to have my thumb right in front of me, hang over the top of the clay, and then I'm going to use my right hand to push the clay, sort of torque it out of its axis toward 12 o'clock. For some reason, I don't understand why the physics of this works, sort of brings itself back into center on the way down. So if you're working from home, and especially on larger chunks of clay, having some challenges getting the clay to stay on center as you bring it back down from your cone, give that a try. So right from the beginning again on this one, I've got my curve established. but I'm going to make this one a little bit of a wider, flatter bowl. So as I refine that curve, I'm getting everything flatter. With this shape, it's going to be more important to limit how much water I use, especially as the piece gets thinner and larger. I'm just trying to prevent it from getting saturated to the point that it sort of sags. I'm going to use the rib right from the beginning to really compress this. And from here, my pulls, again, we're just going to draw in space. We're going to follow that curve. And right about here, I'm actively slowing the wheel down without changing, without doing anything differently with the pedal. The wider the bowl gets, the faster it's spinning. So just something to keep in mind as you're working on your wheel at home, or when you get back into the studio, your local studio. With wider forms, we're just gonna drop the wheel speed as they stretch out. So my compression on this is driving at much more of an angle back down the wall of the clay. Before this gets too wide and flat, I'm going to go in there with the plastic knife and cut some of that excess away. I can do a lot in the trimming to sort of match the exterior profile to the interior, but I do want to make sure to get that cut so that when I go to trim, I've got a nice even circle to center it to. And as this gets wider and flatter, that just access to that point gets much more challenging. So, like I said, we're going to try to limit water on this, and the best way that I have found to do that is to rely more on the ribs, because they're not going to require any additional water. And actually, in some cases, especially with the metal ribs, they'll draw out some moisture. So I'm just stretching this out, using the rib, sort of pushing down on the rim, stretching it a bit wider, and just like in that first bowl, stretching wider a little bit at a time, and then having everything else underneath it catch up to that, get the rest of the curve in line with it. To a nice heavy compression on this, sort of thicken up the rim. Maybe add a little bit of surface texture. That should play pretty well with the glaze. So these bowls, I'm using Laguna's B-Mix clay. It's a smooth white clay body, technically a cone 5. I've had really good luck firing it up to 6. And I've been experimenting a lot with inlay or mishima. And so that's what all these bowls are sort of getting prepped for, with the exception of that last one that has a lot of surface texture already on the inside. Quarantine scene, Mary, welcome. So the more you throw bowls, the more you can sort of condense the steps together. So after sitting down and throwing for a little while, my opening up step sort of turns into a pull. So you can see that in this one, I've gotten to a much larger form a lot quicker. Ultimately, what I'm trying to do is get to the end shape in as few movements as required to do so without really messing with the shape or the form, or collapsing it. The idea being, I want to introduce as little water as possible so that it can be ready for the next step, the trimming or the surface design or whatever comes next soon, as fast as possible. There's already so much patience required in ceramics that I just figure there's any way to limit how patient I have to be and not get too antsy to trim, the better. So cut a little bit of that away at the bottom. One other technique I like to use a lot is to throw with 2 ribs at the same time. So I'm going to have my green plastic rib on the inside, my metal rib on the outside. And the idea is that if I can keep a consistent sort of negative space between the 2 of them, I can work out any inconsistencies between the 2, in the wall, that everything sort of tidies up. So both ribs have a little bit of pressure on them. The space in between is filling with what's now a really even wall, and at the top it just stretches out just a bit. From here I'm going to stretch on the inside, opening up a little bit, and then everything underneath is going to catch up as the rib travels down on the inside. Give that one more pass. I'm going to open it a little bit at the top. Something else I like to do with this step is to have my left hand as a support. It always feels a little strange to be touching the clay in 2 spots. But so my right hand is holding the rib here at 3 o'clock, and then my left hand is just sort of hanging out on the rim as like a stabilizer. Before this one is done, welcome to those who are new to the broadcast. Thanks for joining. We have been working on a series of bowls in different shapes. And for this one, I'm going to put in sort of some asymmetry at the end here. So I'm going to get my fingers a little damp, and then rather than doing a nice steady pull, I'm going to do a really irregular sort of fast and slow and wonky pull to put some twists in here. I just want to stop just short of the rim because I do want to maintain a true symmetrical circle at the top so that trimming gets really easy. Or I shouldn't say so the trimming gets really easy, but I can easily center for the trimming. So to touch that up, I'm just going to go back in with this chamois at the end. Tidy up the rim, make sure it's on center. And so this bowl now has some twists and asymmetry that will make it sort of an individual bowl from all the others, even though that might throw them exactly the same way. All right, so 4 down, 1 more to go. For this one, I'm going to throw a shape similar to our first bowl. For this one, I'm looking for a symmetrical, flat surface that I can do some of that Mishima inlay work on. I've been playing with testing different waxes to seal off the surface that I'll cut through and then pack the cut lines with the Amico velvet underglazes. And I've been getting lots of good information, and I've been having some really good results so far. I will say I'm pretty antsy to get things fired and see, how they go the rest of the way. So now that I'm centered, just to sort of recap, when we're working on bowls, I want a centered shape that is slightly narrower at the base, resembling a doorknob, just because that's going to act as a rough draft of our bowl shape. It's going to limit how much clay I've got to cut off at the end, drilling down. And then my opening up step, once I've got a curve established, sort of turns right into a pull. And from here, I'm just going to continue to refine and establish that curve on the inside, make sure that I don't get stuck with a corner or one of those sort of shoulders, those learner's curves down in the bottom third of the piece. And from there, I'll move to a pull, where I am just drawing in space, pulling the clay to the profile I want. So we've thrown some that flare in, some that flare out. This is going to be sort of just in the middle, something that does have a bit of a flare, but nothing too drastic. I'm going to compress my rim, pull out any water, and then go in with my rib to further set that curve, clean the surface, compress, and then pushing from the outside, I'm evening up everything. I'm going to cut a little bit away down at the bottom. And switch back to 2 ribs, green on the inside, metal on the outside. And this is just evening everything out. It's also leaving both surfaces clean, flat, almost burnished. Where I'll be trimming the outside, it's not as important, but I leave that surface super clean or burnished if I can. It's a bonus, but the real focus is going to be on the inside. So as a second to last step, I'm going to take my metal rib and touch up the entire curve on the inside, making sure the surface is super clean, super even, especially looking ahead to doing inlay work. I don't want any sort of topography. Addie, welcome. I don't want any of that sort of topography in the clay. I want it to be nice and even so that the lines I razor through the wax are going to be at a consistent depth. And my final step for this guy is going to be to compress and tidy up the rim. Just kidding. I got left with this line, so I'm going to give it one tiny little more extra pass with the metal rim. All right. So that does it for me today from my home studio. Thank you so much for joining, and thank you so much for staying home.